Hi guys, my name is Joe. Welcome to my YouTube channel. And on this channel I spend a lot of time reviewing martial arts books, so I thought I'd give you guys a brief tour of my library. So I've arranged these alphabetically by subject, but also a little by author, which we're going to get into. So the first section right here is Aikido. We move into my two Bartitsu books. And then we move on to biography or autobiography. And this last book here on the end is the beginning of my two-book biomechanics section. Go down here for the second. Then we go on to boxing. So the most useful to the least useful, in my opinion. Although we do end with more of the bare knuckle stuff. Then we get into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I have this in a separate category from traditional Jiu-Jitsu. Again, we start with overviews and move on to specific positions like top game, bottom game, no-gi, some self-defense and no-holds-barred aspects. And then I have two books on capoeira right here, and from there we go on to Chinese martial arts. You thought I was going to say Kung Fu, but I wasn't. So we started with Shaolin, and then we're moving on to various other quote-unquote external systems like Choi Lei Fut, like Hung Quin. Got a rather extensive Wing Chun Kung Fu section. Then we move on to the so-called internal styles of Taiji, Bagua, and Xingyi, and texts that cover, various elements of all of those styles. From there we go on to throws from Shuaijiao and other Chinese arts, and locking like Chin Na. Then we get to the Sanda, the full contact fighting elements, and finish that up with a few books that give us a historical point of view. Then we get on to Filipino martial arts. Next is Filipino martial arts, like Arnis, Eskrima, and Kali, though I don't think I actually have any Kali books. Again, more Filipino martial arts. Then this section here, these three books are alphabetically there in I for instructor. I couldn't think of any other place to put them. And after that we get on to general martial arts studies. And I would consider general martial arts studies books that cover several different martial arts in just short little aspects, or books that approach martial arts that include drills that could be applied to multiple martial arts and are not specific to a single one. We got on to the grappling section. I consider this sort of non-specific sport grappling. Includes texts on gi grappling, no gi grappling, throws. Some of them are on specific submissions, like triangle chokes and arm bars. And we get general grappling principles. And then we move on to Hapkido and Hwarangdo. I'm almost considering making a K section for Korean martial arts generic. Right now, that's where I've chosen to put these. And from there, we go on to the first author that I have singled out, Mark Hatmaker. Starting here, all the way to here. These are all books by Mark Hatmaker, although She's Tough is also co-written by his wife. Actually, she should probably get the primary credit for that one. But Hatmaker. After that section, we move on to Jeet Kune Do, starting with Bruce Lee's writings, and starting with Bruce Lee's writings, and moving on to Judo, again starting with some of the older writings, some of the more general overviews, and then we get into more specific stuff like Judo throws. We have Jiu-Jitsu or Jujutsu, traditional Jiu-Jitsu, Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, whatever you'd like to call it. Most of these are Gendai or post-Meiji styles. And from there I have my single book on Kalari Payat, and then we get to karate. I have a lot of karate books because that was my original background and I like it. So, once again, we start with more of the general overview books, and we move into specific styles, starting with Shotokan, Ishinryu, Shito-ryu, Weichi-ryu, etc. Continuing on with books that are specifically about kata and kata bunkai, then on to sparring, and again finishing up with more historical references. Next we have Kempo, starting with Ed Parker's Infinite Insight series, including a few different types of Kempo, and then we move on to kickboxing. The kickboxing section here is sort of subdivided between general kickboxing, then starting here we have Muay Thai, which is sort of, in this categorization, a subset of kickboxing, and I have my one book on Savate also in that section. After kickboxing, we move on to kicking. So the section on non-specific martial arts kicking continues till we get to knife fighting. That's a kind of a short section, and then I have my 4 books on Krav Maga, and continue on until we get to the second author that has been given his own section. That's Mark McYoung. After Mark McYoung, we get into military combat, starting with the more modern combat to World War II combat, and then more, let's say, historical military combat. From military, we move on to mixed martial arts. This is a pretty big section on its own. Again, we move from the more comprehensive texts into the more specific texts. This set of binders right here, that's the collection of a book called The Fighter's Notebook, which came in a 3-ring binder. And I found by separating it out into 5 smaller books, it just works out better. Hey, Benny. So continuing with mixed martial arts, we get into more specific things like specific guard work, clinch work, and then we get to like history and a more academic take on it. And then we come to another author that's been singled out. That's Mr. Fred Neff. I have no idea what he's doing now, but back when I was young, I found his books in my public library and I absolutely love them, so I got copies. After that, we get into ninjutsu. And the ninjutsu collection is probably going to get some raised eyebrows from some of you because we start with what might be considered some more authentic sources to some more questionable ones, and finally, Ashita Kim, who's sort of a known fraud. After the ninjutsu section, we move on to the philosophy section. These just happen to be the martial arts specific philosophy books. And after that, we get on to physical conditioning, or we move on to physical conditioning, starting with just general overall fight conditioning. Then we get into more sport specific stuff like judo and boxing. And then moving on to just general overall conditioning from various fitness programs to specific forms of conditioning like circuit training, ab training, flexibility. And we finish with sports first aid. From physical fitness, we move on to pressure points. We do have a few different books on those. And from pressure points, we move on to psychology. Again, I have more books on psychology. These are just more martial arts specific psychology books. Sports psychology, warrior psychology, if you will. I got my 3-book collection on Sambo. And from Sambo, we move on to self-defense, starting with the more conceptual books. And now we're moving on to the more physical side of the self-defense. And from self-defense, we move into silat first, and stick fighting, and then a little bit of strategy, and there we go on to swordsmanship, and I've actually got more of that than I thought I'd have. From swordsmanship, both Eastern and Western, we move on to Taekwondo, starting with overviews, moving into books that are specific to forms. From Taekwondo, we move on to Tang Sudo. From Tang Sudo onto Mr. Tadashi, who has a pretty extensive set on various aspects of fighting. From Tadashi, we move on to Jeff Thompson, and I got a lot of his books. From T, we move on to W, so weapons. And this is more generic weapons. So we have Kobudo, I also have a book on tomahawk fighting. From there we move on to wrestling, starting with amateur wrestling, moving on to catch as catch can, and including some books more on the history of catch wrestling than on the technique. So, that's my collection. Thank you for joining me on this tour.